Greetings, friends and brethren. Is the future king of the south about to rise up? Is he rising up right now? Now, does the Bible actually even teach there's such a thing as a future king of the south? And if there is, does it give any clues? And if so, can you find any type of evidence of this in the current news? Now, did the old Worldwide Church of God teach that there was a future king of the south? Some people said that it did not. Could a group such as the Muslim Brotherhood that's in the news from time to time be involved? Well, those are some of the questions I want to address right now. And first of all, what we're going to do is we're going to go to the Bible, because it's in the Bible, in the book of Daniel, chapter 11, that we first hear about this entity called the King of the South. So let's go to Daniel chapter 11, and we're going to begin in verse 25. Daniel 11 and verse 25. He shall stir up his power. Now you've got to go back to verse 15 to find out who this he is. That particular he is the king of the north. But he shall stir up his power and his courage against the king of the south with a great army. Now we're going to go down to verse 27. Both these kings shall be bent on, hearts shall be bent on evil, and they shall speak lies at the same table, but it shall not prosper. Why? For the end will still be at the appointed time. So we see here that there are two kings who make a deal. This deal is for the appointed time of the end, but the particular deal itself is not the absolute end. Now, when is the appointed time? Well, let's go to verse 29. It says, at the appointed time, he, this is again talking about the king of the north, shall return and go toward the south, but it shall not be like the former or the latter. So we see that there's an appointed time of the end, and one of the things that's going to happen prior to this is some type of a improper deal between the king of the north and the king of the south, where they're both going to lie to one another at the table. That kind of reminds me of what I've heard in the past about a certain deal between Adolf Hitler and the head of Russia back at the time, Stalin. But some type of a lying deal is prophesied to happen toward the end, but before the appointed time of the end. So at the appointed time of the end, we see that this is happening, that the king of the north is going to head down toward the south. Now, the word appointed time is actually Strong's word, number 7150, in both verse 27, which suggests it's in the future, as well as verses 29 and 35 of Daniel 11. The word translated as end is the same word, it's Strong's word 4150, in verse 27 and 45. And that's when the king of the north comes to his final end. And it's also in verse 40 when the king of the north invades the king of the south. So let's also go to verse 35, which says, and some of those of understanding shall fall, to refine them, purify them, make them white until the time of the end, because it's still for the appointed time. So again, this is talking about an end time sequence. A lot of things are happening at the end, the appointed time of the end, including some kind of a deal between the king of the north and the king of the south. Now, if we go to Daniel chapter 11, verse 40, we see something here. At the time of the end, the king of the south shall attack him. So we're talking about the time of the end. Some people have suggested that this perhaps happened in the 1930s or previously, but that was a long time ago. So again, notice it's talking about the time of the end. Now let's go further, because we're going to find out precisely who's involved in this attack. Well, first in verse 40 it says, at the time of the end, the king of the south shall attack him. So the king of the south is attacking somebody. And the somebody that he's attacking, as it says, is the king of the north. And the king of the north shall come up against him like a whirlwind, with chariots, horsemen, many ships, and he shall enter through the countries, overwhelm them, and pass through. So we see that at the time of the end, the king of the south is going to push at or attack or do something to enrage the king of the north. We've got a short video on the identity of the king of the north to prove that the beast to come is European. This is a European power, this king of the north. At some other point in time, I'll probably do a more exhaustive, extensive sermon on that subject. But again, notice that the king of the north is coming down to the south. He's going through many countries. So the king of the south is not just one country. Okay, that's something important to know. It's many countries. Verse 41, he, the king of the north, shall enter the glorious land. That would probably be the area of Palestine, Israel. And many countries shall be overthrown. So a lot of countries are going to be overthrown. But these shall escape from his hand, Edom, Moab, the prominent people of Ammon. Verse 42, he'll stretch out his hand against the countries, and the land of Egypt shall not escape. So he's going against countries, including the land of Egypt. He shall have power over the treasures of gold and silver, and over all the precious things of Egypt. Also the Libyans and Ethiopians shall follow at his heels. Now we'll talk more about the identity, the so-called Ethiopians that this is mentioning. But the Libyans basically meant a North African people. Plus we have Egyptians. Plus we have him going into the glorious land, the area of the Middle East. These basically are lands currently dominated by the Arab peoples. The Arab and Cushite peoples dominate the particular lands that the king of the north is going to invade. So from that, we get a pretty good indication that the king of the south is going to be an Arabic power, probably Cushite power. And in the 21st century, this is a power dominated by Muslims. Now, we're getting close to the time of the end. And because we're getting close to the time of the end, we eventually should see some type of confederation form. Now it's interesting that currently many of the states in Europe, as well as North Africa, have gotten together to form what they call the Union for the Mediterranean. And for a while, by the way, they had a president of the North, who was actually the president of France, Sarkozy, and a president of the South, who at that time was Egypt's president, who was Hosni Mubarak. The reason I mention that is it's certainly possible that an organization such as Union for Mediterranean States will be involved in the deal in Daniel 11:27, where the king of the north and the king of the south make a deal where they're lying to one another. So that the framework for that type of structure already exists. Now, some groups, for some reason, however, do not seem to believe that there is going to be a future king of the south. So I'd like to address those, some of the objections and comments from some of those groups for just a moment, even though I don't agree with them, but we'll go for them first. Here's something that one group wrote in 2004. The prophecy in Daniel 11:40 has already been fulfilled. Now, I don't think it was fulfilled because it's for the time of the end. And the time of the end, we're around the time of the end now, and it has not been fulfilled. And verse 40 is the last time where the king of the south is mentioned. Okay, verse 40 is the last time in that chapter he's mentioned by name. Okay. Beginning with the second half of verse 40, we read exclusively about the king of the north and his activities. That's a stretch. Because if you go through there, yes, it's talking about the king of the north and his activities, but it also mentions Egypt, Edom, Ammon. It mentions the Libyans. In verse 44, rumors from the east and the west. This means then there does not have to be another end-time king of the south. Well, yes, there does, because the end hasn't happened yet. If one were to rise up, following historical and biblical records set forth in the 11th chapter of the book of Daniel, it would have to be mainly modern Ethiopia. But that's also nonsense. I'd like to explain about Ethiopia later, but this is the other argument, that there isn't going to be one, and if there is one, it's going to be Ethiopia. We'll get to that. But as we've said, all which still needs to be fulfilled, and which the previous king of the north under Mussolini did not fulfill, is the invasion of the glorious land by the future and final king of the north, verse 41, including Jerusalem, verse 45, as well as the overthrow of many countries, including Egypt, Libyans, and Ethiopians following at his heels. So that's what this particular group wrote, and I don't agree at all that what happened with Mussolini, again, back in the 1930s, that fulfilled it. And if there is a future king of the south, it has to be the current nation of Ethiopia. And again, I'll get to the Ethiopian portion later. There's another group that has ties to the same group that went out and said the same thing. Now, there's another person who likes to talk about prophecy, and I'd like to just read something he said. if the Menelik Mussolini scenario is a fulfillment, this verse, that's Daniel 11 verse 40, ends the historical record, the fulfillment of this prophecy. If not, this verse may be yet fulfilled a second time. Well, at least he gives the possibility that it's going to be fulfilled later. But again, from at least two different sources, we have people saying, okay, this is back in Mussolini's time. And that's simply not the case. That's too long ago. Jesus said this generation will not pass away till all these things happen. And that generation is pretty much gone. And this end has not happened yet. Now, I've mentioned Egypt a couple of times. Could the final king of the south be based out of Egypt or have some Egyptian involvement? Well, some who don't believe that actually point to a writing from the late Herbert W. Armstrong. He wrote something called The Middle Eastern Prophecy, which is a booklet. And I'd like to read this. Now, it's going to be a fair amount of reading, so let me read this. And Herbert Armstrong was going through Daniel chapter 11. He says, here is verse 5. And the king of the south, Egypt, he inserted that word, shall be strong, and one of his princes, and he shall be strong above him, and have dominion. His dominion shall be a great dominion. Syria's ruler, the king of the north, at this time was Antiochus II, called Theos. His wife was named Laodice, as in Laodicea. And, says Rollin's Ancient History, her influence engaged him in a war with Ptolemy Philadelphus, the king of the south, in BC 260, which terminated 252. Verse 25, Rollins says, threatened by war by the ministers of Ptolemy, Philometor, now the king of the south, who claimed Seal Syria and Palestine as a dowry of Cleopatra, the late queen mother, Antiochus marches toward Egypt, BC 171. So we're seeing he's talking about different people that he felt at one point in time were fulfilling prophecies related to the king of the south prophecies. Again, these are the older prophecies, the first portion of that chapter. But he was met by his nephew Ptolemy Philometor, king of the south, with another immense army, but the Egyptian king was defeated through treachery of his own officers and was outwitted by Antiochus. Verses 26-27. Then continuing with Rawlinson, after his victory at Pelusium, Antiochus advanced toward Memphis, and having obtained possession of the young king's person, the king of the south, endeavored to use him as a tool for effectively causing reduction of the entire country. Who today, now this is written in 1972, although this was written in the 1950s, and I think they just updated in 72. Who today is the king of the south? It cannot be the king of Egypt, for in 31 BC, Egypt became a province of the Roman Empire, swallowed up by the king of the north. Today, Egypt is a republic ruled by native Arabs. It has no king of its own. And he also says, observe, after its conquest by Mussolini, Ethiopia is no longer referred to as the king of the south. So people have pointed to that. People who've had some type of worldwide Church of God background say, look, Egypt cannot be the king of the south. It's probably Ethiopia. This is what Herbert Armstrong taught. Those of you who believe that he didn't teach that are wrong. Those of you who believe that there's a coming king of the south, you're all wrong. That's what some people said. However, what really happened was Herbert Armstrong originally wrote this in the 1950s, and then updated it slightly later as he got older. And I was speaking to, I spoke to several of his top aides while he was alive, and basically they told me, oh yeah, he would go back and correct things when he get a chance, but some things he never got a chance to take a look at in more depth. But even in the 1972 version, or 74 version, he said that it was not Egypt of today. Now, why is that important? Because in his magazine, The Plain Truth, in 1963, he had an article in there that his son wrote called, And When You See the Abomination of Desolation, or actually called When You See the Abomination. I'd like to read this because I think this will dispel the notion that the old radio/worldwide Church of God did not believe Egypt could be the king of the south is wrong. Let me read this. Daniel was given specific visions of events to occur in our time. Notice that the time of the end, this prophecy then is absolutely dated as pertaining to our day now. So he's saying it's a time of the end prophecy. Shall the king of the south push at him, and the king of the north shall come against him like a whirlwind with chariots, with horsemen, many ships. He shall enter in the countries and shall overthrow flow and pass over. Verse 40. Bible scholars have recognized the first typical fulfillment of this surprising prophecy, but have failed to see its literal application to our times. But what have the modern powers meant by these designations? Remember, the Bible is written spiritually and geographically from the point of view of Palestine. If you were to look at a map, you'll find two powers fitting this description. You'd have a fairly easy task. Who else could this be except the coming United States of Europe, a resurrection of the ancient Holy Roman Empire, just as we've been fearlessly proclaiming, a rearmed Germany heading up the final union in Europe. This is the biblical king of the north. The king of the south? Egypt, of course. That's what the old Worldwide Church of God, Radio Church of God wrote. Egypt, of course. Not it couldn't be Egypt. Egypt, of course. But not Egypt of today. And that's what Herbert Armstrong's article 1972 said. It's not the current Egypt. Egypt a few more years from now. Well, it was decades. He got his years wrong. Mr. Armstrong's son on this. Egypt, as she continues to expand, bringing in more and more of the North African Mohammed nations into the same Afro-Arabian power bloc. So what he's saying is, back in his time, Egypt was trying to get some of the Arab nations together. And it didn't fully happen then. But it would be Egypt, but not Egypt as it currently was, and it was going to change. And it was going to have some type of confederation with other Arabic Islamic states. And that is, I believe, correct. Now, there was an evangelist in the old Worldwide Church of God named Raymond McNair. And back in 2005, after he'd left, Worldwide Church of God had apostatized by that time, he wrote, Daniel 11 also mentions some of the Mideast peoples who will be involved in that struggle among nations at the close of the age. The belligerents will include the king of the north, the leader of the European Union, also called the beast, the king of the south, an Islamic leader apparently from Egypt or some other Muslim state is also referred to. The following lands people are specifically mentioned: Egypt, the Holy Land, being Israel, Palestine, Ethiopians, modern Cushites south of Egypt, and I'll get to that later. But Raymond McNair has that correct. These are not people in the country of Ethiopia. Libya, Edom, Moab, and Ammon. Many descendants of the ancient peoples now known as the Edomites or Emudians now live in the West Bank, Jordan, Iraq, Turkey, Syria, Arabia, Yemen, the Persian Gulf states, etc. So he identified those people from Daniel chapter 11 basically being the Arabic peoples as well as some of the Turkish peoples. Now, I'd like to read something from the Bible again, and this is going to be from Isaiah chapter 30, verse 6. And I'm going to read the New King James Version for this verse, but the verse after I'm going to read from a different translation. The burden against the beasts of the south. So he's calling it the beast of the south. Now this is important because the king of the north is also called the beast, except he's the other beast. So he's the beast of the south. So the idea that the king of the south could be a beast, like the king of the north is a beast, makes sense to me. Through a land of trouble and anguish, from those which came the lioness and the lion, the viper and the fiery flying serpent, they will carry their riches on the back of young donkeys and their treasures on the humps of camels, to a people who shall not profit. Notice the bringing in of camels, which is something that tends to be native. Those animals are native in the Arab lands. Okay? Now, this time I'm going to read verse 7 from the Message, so it'll word different than what you probably have it. Isaiah 30, verse 7. Egypt is all show, no substance. My name for her is toothless dragon. I mention that because the Bible says the king of the south is going to push against the king of the north. The king of the south is going to actually think it's got a chance to win. The Bible says in Daniel 11:40 it doesn't have a chance, it's going to lose. If this is referring to that, which I think it is, there's a hint there that Egypt's going to pretend, they're going to try, but they're not really going to be able to pull it off. It's also been speculated that Isaiah 19 verse 4 could be related to the king of the south by somebody who was also once in the old Worldwide Church of God. And that verse says, and the Egyptians I will give into the hand of a cruel master, and a fierce king will rule over them, says the Lord, Lord of hosts. Now this cruel master could be the king of the south, Or it could be actually the king of the north once he takes it over. Now additionally, in Isaiah 31, it lists the destructions of the Egyptians in verses 1 through 3 ahead of Assyria, verses 8 through 9. Just like the book of Daniel shows the destruction of the king of the south in Daniel 11, 40 through 33. Ahead of that, of the king of the north, which happens in verses 44 and 45. Now there's other quotes that show chaos and destruction coming to Egypt. Going back to Isaiah 31, let me read this. Verse 3. Now the Egyptians are men and not God, and their horses are flesh and not spirit. When the Lord stretches out his hand, both he who helps will fall, and he who is helped will fall down. They will all perish together. So those who join together with Egypt at the end are not going to do well. Now if you go to Isaiah 19, I read part of it before. Let's go back to it. Starting verse 1. The burden against Egypt. Behold, the Lord rides on a swift cloud and will come into Egypt. The idols of Egypt will totter at his presence, and the heart of Egypt will melt in its midst. I will set Egyptians against the Egyptians. Everyone will fight against his brother. Everyone against his neighbor, city against city, kingdom against kingdom. The spirit of Egypt will fall in its midst. I will destroy their counsel. They will consult the idols and charmers and mediums and sorcerers. And then the Egyptians would give them into the hand of a cruel master. And so it's possible that we may see some riots in Egypt before the king of the south rises up. But it's also possible after the king of the south goes after the king of the north that there will be this type of destruction when the king of the north comes in. Now interestingly, the idea that the king of the south could be from Egypt is not a brand new concept. The Roman Catholic saint and doctor of the church, Jerome, wrote something about this. And I'd like to read what he wrote. This is his commentary on Daniel chapter 11. As to the Antichrist, there is no question but he is going to fight against the Holy Covenant. And I agree with that. And when he first makes war against the king of Egypt, he shall be straightway frightened by the assistance of the Romans. So let's talk about that for a second. He's going into Daniel chapter 11, verse 30, where it talks about the king of the north is going to head south, and some type of a naval presence is going to scare him off. Now, I believe the most likely naval presence that's going to scare off the king of the north at this time is actually the American naval force, like for the United States, not the Romans. I will also comment that one error that Jerome has, like most Protestants and and most Roman Catholics, is that he considers that the Antichrist is the king of the north. The Antichrist will support the king of the north and support the beast power, but the Antichrist himself is actually going to be like an anti-pope religious leader. But generally, the thrust of what he's got is correct. It says, the Antichrist, in this case, he really means the king of the north, shall first fight against the king of the south or Egypt, and shall afterwards conquer Libya and Ethiopia. Now, I think that's a mistranslation there of Ethiopia, but he's got it correct. Again, this is tying into Daniel 11, where we see that the king of the north is the one who takes care of Libya and Egypt and that kind of a thing. Now, is there anybody interested in Egypt now? Well, the Muslim Brotherhood originally was officially established in Egypt, and they're putting something together that could be like the King of the South, but I'll get to them a little later. But I'd like to read from a report from MSNBC. This is from 2011. Egypt is also widening its gaze beyond Gaza. Egypt wants to lead the Arab world to create a new bloc to counter NATO, to be an alternative to the EU, a Middle East with collective power and bargaining rights. It may sound naive, it may be overly optimistic. It may ring of Egypt's late President Gamal Abdel Nasser, the champion of pan-Arabism, but Egypt wants to give it a try. So Egypt wants to be like NATO, which means they want military commanders. Whether those commanders will be the king of the south or people work for the king of the south, that's not as clear, but the reality is, it's even in the secular press, Egypt wants this. Now, I'd like to read something from Reuters. This is from late 2012. Egypt, a long-standing U.S. ally, now under Islamic leadership after last year's overthrow of Hosni Mubarak, took center stage. Clinton said, Egypt's new government is assuming the responsibility and leadership that has long made this country a cornerstone for regional stability and peace. That was from Hillary Clinton. Egypt walked a fine line between its sympathies for Hamas, an offshoot of the Muslim Brotherhood, to which Morsi belongs. Morsi is President Morsi. He's the president of Egypt, and he's part of the Muslim Brotherhood. And it wants to preserve its peace treaty that it's got. Part of the reason is because the United States gives Egypt a lot of money because of this peace treaty. But the reality is Egypt is trying to figure out how to walk this line to keep the United States funds coming in, and not to scare people off, and to work through the Muslim Brotherhood in order to get this pan-Islamic empire to form. Anyway, the Bible clearly shows that an empire is going to form in the Middle East, and Egypt is going to be involved. Now, this time I'd like to go to Ezekiel Chapter 30. This is a very interesting prophecy here, and I'd like to read through it. Ezekiel Chapter 30, starting in verse 1. The word of the Lord came to me, Son of man, prophesy and say, this is what the sovereign Lord says. Wail and say, alas for that day, for the day is near, the day of the Lord is near, a day of clouds, a time of doom for the nations. Now pay close attention to this. A sword shall come against Egypt, and anguish will come upon Cush. Now who's Cush? Those are those so-called Ethiopians. The word means Cushite, actually. This is the same scenario we're seeing in the book of Daniel, chapter 11, verses 42 and 43. When the slain fall in Egypt, her wealth will be carried away and her foundations torn down. And the Bible clearly says the king of the north is going to invade the king of the south, take away the gold and precious things of Egypt. Verse 5, Cush, the Cushites, which is basically Libya, or Lydia is Libya, and all Arabia, Libya, and the people of the covenant land will fall by the sword along with Egypt. So Egypt's allies are going to fall. Well, the Bible says those same allies are falling in Daniel chapter 11, 40 through 43. Verse 6, this is what the Lord says. The allies of Egypt will fall, and her proud strength will fail. From Midgal to Aswan, they will fall by the sword within her, declares the sovereign Lord. They will be desolate among the desolate lands, and their cities will lie among ruined cities. Then they will know that I am the Lord when I set a fire to Egypt, and all her helpers are crushed. On that day will go out for me ships to frighten Cush out of her complacency. Anguish will take hold of them on the day of Egypt's doom, for it's sure to come. Well, by the way, I was reading from the NIV, if it didn't sound exactly like yours. So we see the destruction of Egypt and her allies, and the taking away of wealth. Pretty much seems like this ties with Daniel chapter 11, verses 40 through 43, which gives us, therefore, additional insight who the peoples are. These are the peoples primarily of the Middle East. These are primarily Arabic peoples. There could be some Persians. There will also be some Turks involved, and Cushites. Now, Ezekiel 32, 2 through 16 talks about something similar, but I'd like to just talk about and read verses 11 and 12. For thus says the Lord God, the sword of the king of Babylon shall come upon you. By the swords of the mighty warriors, all of them, the most terrible of nations, I will cause your multitude to fall. They shall plunder the pomp of Egypt, and all of its multitude shall be destroyed. So again, here's a third time we're hearing a power is going to come. This is the king of Babylon, king of the north, is going to come down on Egypt and its allies. And Egypt's going to be plundered. And so we see this again. So it's not just in Daniel 11 we hear about the king of the south. Now it's true that's the only place that the word king of the south is used. But if you let the Bible interpret itself, you'll start to see, hey, a lot of these prophecies are lining up. And that's one of the things I'm trying to explain here. By knowing how these prophecies line up and who these people are, this better helps all of us look for who the final king of the south will be. Now, some people have a different opinion. Now, even if Ezekiel 32 has no future fulfillment, others have a different idea about the identity of the king of the south. And one I'd like to talk about now is one held by a self-appointed false prophet, and he believes that the king of the south is Iran. Now, I'd like to read what he wrote. Daniel 11:42 implies that Egypt will be allied with the king of the south or Iran. The king of the south or Iran is going to push at him. That is the king of the north, the European Union. The king of the south is about state-sponsored terrorism. Well, there will be terrorism involved, I agree. That is how Iran became king. Iran will not be the king of the south. Daniel 11:40-43 is an end-time prophecy. It's about a nation that's always pushing its foreign policy. It pushes until it starts war. Having such power means that it must be a large oil-producing country. This king is close to Jerusalem, Egypt, Ethiopia, and Libya. Who else could this be in the end time but Iran? Iran is extremely radical and the king over radical Islam. That's what this person wrote. He also wrote, notice his prophecy in Daniel 11:40. Iran leads this king of the south. And so he keeps saying that. Now, he says, here's what I wrote back in 1993. So when does the king of the south push the king of the north? It must happen after the book of Daniel was revealed to Herbert Armstrong in this end time. Daniel 12:9 tells us the end begins when Daniel is revealed. This book can only be understood in the end times. So the king of the south must arrive after Daniel was revealed to God's end time church, specifically to Herbert Armstrong. Now, this is kind of interesting because Herbert Armstrong never taught that the end time king of the south was Iran. But he brings Herbert Armstrong's name in it, and some people bring his name in it, and it's like, but Herbert Armstrong never taught the king of the south was Iran. These verses point to a king of the south that's yet for the future. I believe all indications point to radical Islam headed by Iran and this king. Then he gets even bolder. How could I have known so long that Iran would be the king of the south and clash the Holy Roman Empire? Because what's happening in the Middle East, in Iran, coupled with Bible prophecy. You need to watch Libya and Ethiopia. They're about to fall under heavy influence and control of Iran, the king of the south. Now, how could he understand this falsehood about the king of the south? He says he's understanding it, and therefore he's got it. He's bragging, like he's a prophet, and therefore that's probably how he knows. Well, I thought I would try to make this a little easier, since many of you are probably not overly familiar with how the Middle East looks. So I brought an atlas here, and from this atlas, I wanted to show that. Let's go here. So this is an atlas of the Middle East. This is Jerusalem. Now remember before, the teaching of the old worldwide Church of God, as well as other groups, by the way, including non-Church of God groups, is that Palestine, Jerusalem, is pretty much the direction, or the base, and the direction is based on there. So the king of the north would be believed to be probably north of Jerusalem, somewhere up here. And the king of the south would be primarily south of Jerusalem. But where's Iran? If you actually look at the latitude line from Jerusalem, you go over here, this is Iran. All this, where my hand is, all that's Iran. Tehran's up here on the north side, but Iran's almost even geographically with Jerusalem. Straight east. About half of Iran is south, about half of Iran is north. But I don't believe it's the king of the south. Its geographic location doesn't make sense. And I wanted to show that to everybody. Again, this is Jerusalem. This is the latitude lines. It goes right over here to Iran, which is all this. This is Iran. Iran is not the king of the south. And I wanted to show this clearly so people could look at a map. Look at your own map. Prove it to yourself. Iran is not the king of the south. It is not south of Jerusalem. Yet there are other Church of God groups that do not claim to be led by a prophet or somebody along that line, who have also said Iran could be the king of the south. One says, is Iran the king of the south, the Bible prophecy? We've got the scenario, but all the details aren't in place yet. So that's one Church of God group. Well, we don't have all the details yet, that's correct. But one detail we know is Iran's not the king of the south, so they're off. Then a couple of the largest groups that split off, reformed after the old worldwide Church of God, it says the same basic thing. It's talking about back to Iran, back to Daniel's enigmatic prediction. He spoke of two geopolitical configurations, kings of the south and north. It's too soon to tell whether Ahmadinejad will become the first king, but it's possible that the group backing that king of the south could well come from that particular Islamic community. So there was a hint there that Iran, from this other Church of God group, could be the king of the south. It's not going to be. And then this one of those groups also said that the king of the south is possibly an Islamic group of peoples. Explained in Daniel 11, 40 through 45. Well, if the time of the end is anywhere near here, it's definitely Islamic people. It's not possibly. It's definitely Islamic people. Another group who actually gets the identity right, but they get it off the geography a little bit, says the king of the south is not Iran. That's correct. The king of the south cannot be Iran. Iran is north of Jerusalem. Well, as I said, about half of it's south of Jerusalem. I would say that if you wanted to use geography, and what we were doing a few moments ago, Iran is to the east of Jerusalem. Now, Iran is also a bit different than the Arab peoples. They speak Farsi. The people are Persian. They tend to be strict Muslims, but they don't tend to be. They're not Arabs. And again, while Daniel 11:40 through 43 lists some people, it doesn't actually list peoples who are Iranian. However, there are some of the peoples listed in the confederation in Ezekiel Chapter 30 that possibly could include some Persians, so there may be some Persian support. But again, they're not the leader. In that particular part, it's Egyptians or people who are ethnically Egyptian. So I want to make this clear. When I was talking about Egypt, while it is certainly possible the person could physically be in the land of Egypt, be somebody who had Egyptian blood or heritage, which would be most of the Arabic people. So we're looking most likely for an Arabic person. Now, getting back to the teachings of the old worldwide Church of God, in 1974, there was a Good News article called Watch the Middle East, and it said, the longest prophecy in the Bible, the 11th chapter of Daniel, specifically concerns the Middle East. Verses 40 through 45 are yet to be fulfilled. They reveal startling events that are yet to take place in the Middle East. So specifically he's teaching, look, the old worldwide Church of God in 1974 specifically taught, look, these things starting in verse 40 are going to happen. Now, as far as Herbert Armstrong goes, he actually believed that there would be fulfillment of verses in Daniel chapter 11, starting in verse 21. Let me just read this. From Herbert Armstrong, Plain Truth, 1967, June. In Daniel 11:21, referring to the original typical fulfillment to Antiochus Epiphanes, there shall stand up a vile person. So once again, before the second coming of Christ, a vile leader will stop the daily sacrifices from being offered. This same prophecy spoken of by Jesus is also reported by Luke 21:20 through 24. Now, why is this important? Well, this is important because this vile person hasn't written up yet. The daily sacrifices haven't started, so they haven't been stopped. So Herbert Armstrong is saying Daniel 11:21 is future fulfillment. Well, so does Daniel verses 40 through 45. And Herbert Armstrong clearly believed that. Furthermore, in the old Bible correspondence course, they taught this in 1972. At least part of Daniel 11 must also be dual. No wonder we find this chapter concludes with the time of the end, verse 40, leading to the resurrection of the saints. Verse 40 discusses the king of the south. Now, in the Plain Truth, May 3rd, 1975, there's an article called Watch the Middle East. Garner Ted Armstrong wrote, prophecy shows some type of shoving match precipitated by the king of the south, who will unleash a whirlwind against the king of the north. So that should be very, very clear that the old worldwide Church of God taught this. And what about Mussolini? Well, in December of 1979, the Plain Truth said, who's the king of the south? In verse 40, we skipped to the time of the end. The verse undoubtedly found partial fulfillment in the offensive of 1896, and then jumps further. But Mussolini did not finish the prophecy. Yet, is there to be a final king of the north, there may very well observe the same manner. So in the same manner as the king of the north is going to come, a final king of the south, an overall leader of an Arab-Muslim confederation, possibly bearing the very title Mahdi, will rise up. Daniel 11:40 through 41. The Arab-Muslim confederation will be thrown in chaotic disarray in the face of invasion. So when the king of the south is attacked, that's what's going to happen. So there's no doubt that the old worldwide Church of God taught this. It also taught the supreme office of caliph. Originally elective, became hereditary. Eventually, caliphs became figurehead or puppet leaders. Many Arabs seek to recreate the political, theological unity of early Islamic caliphate. And that's what we're starting to see now. We're starting to see that kind of rise. But I want to go further. Now, in December 1980, the year that people believe Herbert Armstrong got the church back on track, there's an article that says, Bible prophecy reveals the emergence of an Arab-Muslim confederation in the Middle East. It's referred to in prophecy as the King of the South. This confederation will play a crucial role in end-time events. So there should be no doubt that that's what the teaching was. But people still don't know that. And that was also repeated, by the way, in June 1983. So if Herbert Armstrong didn't think there was a future king of the South, he certainly wouldn't have that printed in 1980, and he shouldn't have had it repeated in 1983. Now, some type of Islamic transnational group is likely to be a factor in the formation of the king of the South. Why? Because in the 21st century, the nations that I was referring to in Daniel 11:40 through 43, and Ezekiel 31 through 9, are basically Arab nations. Yeah, there's some Arabs, Islamic nations. Yeah, there are some non-Muslims in those nations, and there's some non-Arab peoples in those nations, and some of the nations, such as Edom, are primarily Turkish, and the Cushites are primarily black. But that being said, all those nations are basically, those peoples are basically now predominantly Islamic. Now, back in 2009, I wrote the following in a book. The Bible predicts at the appointed time, a king of the north and a king of the south will rise. Various statements that Barack Obama has made suggest he will implement policies that will likely lead to the multinational formations that will ultimately have these kings. Islamic prophecy. Barack Obama to aid the rise of the king of the south. According to a commentary by Amir Tahari in Forbes, there's a Shiite prophecy that some believe fit Barack Obama. Now, I'm not going to go into that prophecy right now, but basically they believe that when there's a tall black leader in charge of the armies, the strongest armies on the planet, this is a signal for an Islamic leader to rise up. Okay? Now, I don't read Persian or Arabic, whichever language it was actually written in, so I'm just getting this secondhand, so I don't know for sure if it's referring to Barack Obama, if he met all the criteria. However, here's something I did write, and I said that in my book too, by the way. If Barack Hussein Obama is the President of the United States until 2013 to 2017, and he has been, his administration will help lead to the rise of the future king of the South, who is mentioned in end-time Bible prophecy. So that's what I wrote. Now, when I wrote that book, a lot of events were starting to align with the book. That was the 2012 book, for those of you wondering. But for quite a few years, I was wondering precisely how this pan-Arabic entity, this transnational Muslim group would form. Now, I already knew a couple of pieces. One was I knew about the Union for Mediterranean States, and I knew that the Gulf states were talking about having their own kind of currency union and that kind of stuff. But the tie of religion was always in the back of my mind. Again, as you saw from what I wrote in 2009. Now, there were some groups with those type of goals, like the Taliban, Al-Qaeda, Hamas, and the Muslim Brotherhood. But when I wrote this in 2009, the time for those didn't seem to be quite right. The first three groups are considered way too radical by many, and some felt the Muslim Brotherhood wasn't radical enough. And also at the time I wrote that in 2009, the Muslim Brotherhood was outlawed in Egypt and other places. It was kind of keeping a pretty low profile, but no longer. The Muslim Brotherhood now is out in the open in lots of different places, and they want a transnational Islamic empire, just like the biblical king of the South. Now, I'd like to read a couple of things from the English language website of the Muslim Brotherhood. And by the way, the current president of Egypt, Mohammed Morsi, used to be the webmaster, or in charge of the webmaster, for this website. El-Banan, okay, let me explain it. He was the guy, Bana, he was the guy who actually is credited for forming the Muslim Brotherhood back decades ago, nearly 100 years ago, 80, 90 years ago, was chiefly responsible for the formation of the policies of this association. His efforts deserve great consideration of Islamic society in the revolution to the revival of the Islamic State, Caliphate. The Muslim Brotherhood believed the Caliphate is a symbol of Islamic union and an indication of the bonds between the nations of Islam. They see the Caliphate and its reestablishment as a top priority. Subsequently, an association of Muslim people should be set up which would elect the Imam, which is a religious leader. In their case, this religious leader will also be a political leader. This is a little different than with the King of the North. The King of the North, while he'll have some religious aspect, he'll be primarily a political leader, but he'll be with the Antichrist, who's primarily a religious leader. But the Antichrist will also have political authority. But apparently, according to this one Muslim prophecy or belief, that they would have, the King of the South will actually be kind of a religious leader who's also a military leader, kind of one and the same, whereas again, the King of the North would probably have it kind of split. Now here was also something at the website, an article that was published there called, Who is the Muslim Brotherhood? The world's largest and most influential Islamic movement, founded in Egypt in 1928. Well, there was some discussion in England, by the way. The group was originally focused on ridding the country of corrupting secular influences brought by British colonial rule. Over the years, it established branches and affiliates in many countries to promote traditional Sunni Islamic morals, justice, and eradication of poverty and corruption. The Islamic nation, its charter states, quote, must be fully prepared to fight the tyrants and the enemies of Allah as a prelude to establishing an Islamic state, end quote. Ideally, a re-established caliphate, or empire, Islamic Empire, stretching from Spain across the Middle East and Central Asia to Indonesia to be governed according to Islamic Sharia law. And that's from the website of the Muslim Brotherhood. Now, so that's their top priority, to have a pan-Islamic caliphate. Now, I don't believe that they're going to get Spain, if my knowledge of biblical prophecy is correct. But a lot of what they do want to get, they'll go from the far west of Africa, North Africa, the portion of North Africa, the Middle East, the Arab Peninsula, possibly Afghanistan, maybe even Pakistan will cooperate for a while. India is kind of in the way for it to get India, so some of their other goals I don't think they'll be able to hit. Now, as far as Pakistan goes, Pakistan is kind of interesting. It might cooperate with the King of the South for a while. Pakistan has nuclear weapons. It is believed it has made deals with the Saudis. Saudi Arabia supposedly can get nuclear weapons, supposedly if Iran gets them or for some reason Saudi Arabia wants them. So it could be that Pakistan will provide some weaponry to this. And this might be one of the reasons why the King of the South will think he's got enough power to take over or push at the King of the North. I don't know if Pakistan will be involved that way, but it's certainly possible. But Pakistan does have nuclear weapons. Iran's pushing toward getting some. And the rest of the Arab world, a lot of the Arab world, by the way, is very concerned about Iran. So we may see them do something there. Now, to bring enough Arabs together, Muslims together, nations, I think they need a strong man of some kind. They want one. They call him the Imam Mahdi sometimes. They call him the Caliphate. The Bible seems to call this type of person the King of the South. Now remember, the Muslim Brotherhood has been called the world's most influential Islamic movement. That's from Al Jazeera, which is an Arab publication. Now, interestingly, the U.S. President Obama's administration has directly or indirectly supported the rise of the Muslim Brotherhood in nations such as Egypt, Libya, Syria, Somalia, and others in the Middle East and North Africa. This is consistent with what I predicted he would do, and consistent with some of the words that he's done. Now, Tunisia, by the way, is very interesting. They had an election a couple of years ago, and in November 2011, actually, and so it's not quite that long ago. And the winner said the sixth caliphate had arrived. The sixth caliphate. The caliphates are these Islamic empires. The fifth one ended with World War I and shortly thereafter with the Turkish Empire. They want a sixth. Now, as it turns out, the leader, Hamadi Jebeli, who was the Secretary General of Ennahda, they call this a moderate Islamic party, at least the one who wrote this, Islamist party. Now, Ennahda is a branch, or the political branch, basically, of the Muslim Brotherhood in Tunisia. And he says that we now have the emergence of the sixth righteous caliphate. That's what he said when his party won. Okay? So, this has all been a goal. Now, in 2012, there's a Muslim preacher who told thousands of Brotherhood supporters in Egypt the following. This is when Mohammed Morsi was running for president of Egypt but hadn't gotten it yet. We can now see the dream of the Islamic Caliphate is being realized. God willing, Dr. Mohammed Morsi will win. The capital of the Caliphate, the capital of the United States of the Arabs, will be Jerusalem. Our capital will not be Cairo, Mecca, or Medina. Yes, Jerusalem's our goal. We shall pray in Jerusalem or die as martyrs on the threshold. Well, the year is off slightly here, but anyway, Mohammed Morsi is now the president of Egypt. As I mentioned before, he used to run the website of the Muslim Brotherhood, and I read you what it said when he was the president of it. And it still says it, by the way. Those articles were up when I checked not too long ago. Now, as far as the Muslim Brotherhood goes, some might point to Jordan, Turkey, Saudi Arabia, and some of the Gulf states and say, wait, they don't support the Muslim Brotherhood. They don't want to be part of it. That's true. If you take your Bible, if you go to back to Daniel 11, there's some things I skipped over on purpose before. Starting in verse 25, it's talking about the king of the south, and I'm going to get in the middle of this. And the king of the south shall be stirred up to battle with a very great army and mighty army, but he shall not stand, for they shall devise plans against him. Yes, those who eat a portion of his delicacies shall destroy him. Now, there's the New Jerusalem Bible says he's going to be destroyed by trickery. In other words, someone's going to pretend to be on his side and is not going to be on his side. Now, who might that be? Well, if you go down to Daniel chapter 11, you go further down, verse 41. These, at the end of it, these shall escape from the hand of the king of the north. Who escapes? Edom, Turkey, Moab, and the prominent people of Ammon. These are talking about people in Jordan, some of the Gulf states, maybe some of the Arabians. These are people who probably will have decided that they have to make some kind of peace with the king of the south, or they'll have revolution or too many problems in their countries. But notice that when the king of the north invades, he lets them go. Why might he let them go? Probably because they're involved in the trickery and they betray him. Now, interestingly, there's actually a Catholic prophecy from Nostradamus, and I'd like to read this. It says, "The great Arab shall progress well forward, but betrayed shall be by the Byzantines," or Turks, as it says here. The great Arab. It's possible that Nostradamus was prophesying the king of the south. And notice he's supposed to be betrayed by the Byzantines, the Turks, according to this. And here's a comment from a Catholic writer who wrote about it, Yves Dupont. "Here we are told that Turkey will break its faith with the rest of the Arab world." So that's kind of interesting, because this Catholic writer wasn't looking at the Bible. Nostradamus, maybe he was. But it is interesting, because that's consistent with biblical prophecy. Now, some in Islam have taught that some interesting thing about their leader. It says, Rasulullah Muhammad said, "There'll be 4 peace agreements between you and the Roman Christians. The 4th agreements will be mediated through a person who will be the progeny of the Honorable Aaron, and it will be upheld for 7 years." Now, those of you who watch Bible prophecy know Daniel 9:27 talks about some kind of a deal that's supposed to be for 7 years. So it sounds very, very similar to that. Now, we also know that this peace deal is going to be broken in the middle, and we also know that the king of the south is going to be destroyed by the king of the north. Interestingly, there's an Islamic prophecy that says, "A life of peace as a result of peace agreement between you and the Romans, they will break and attack you." So we see that that's prophesied that this would happen. That even Islamic prophecy knows that there's going to be some kind of a peace deal, and this peace deal is going to be broken, and they're going to be taken over. Again, that's consistent. Now, no, we don't go to Islamic or Catholic prophecy as proof that Bible prophecy is correct. But it's interesting, in their culture, these things are already there. It wouldn't surprise me that the king of the north power will know about the Nostradamus prophecy and say, look, it says the Turks will do this. Let's go and talk to them. Now, without going to too much more detail about the late Herbert Armstrong, he did say regarding Daniel chapter 11:31 and Matthew 24, says, "Never before have we understood these periods of 1260, 1290, 1335 days." And he's going into more details about that in November of 1979. Why do I mention that? Because some point to their understanding of something he wrote in 1952 or 55 or 72 or before, said, aha, what he meant there was basically the Bible, and you can't change it. That is nonsense. He said in 1979 that some of the stuff in Daniel he didn't really get until then, and I would also suggest that he didn't go through all the details and everything there either. Now, briefly, I'd like to comment about this Ethiopian involvement, because there are several sources that I've read to that say it will be Ethiopia or Ethiopia is going to be involved. And that's based on a mistranslation of Daniel 11, verse 43. The problem is the word Ethiopians is not in the Hebrew Old Testament. The word translates Ethiopians is actually the plural of the word Kushii, which according to BibleSoft's New Exhaustive Concordance and Expanded Hebrew-Greek Dictionary means descendants of Cush, the Cushites, or in other words, people of dark color. And they're commonly sometimes called Cush or Cushites in many other New Testament, Old Testament passages. It's not necessarily those from Egypt. There was one famous person the Old Testament translates in English, refers to as from Ethiopia, and that's the Queen of Sheba. And even the term Sheba does not usually refer to Ethiopia in the Bible. And different commentaries say that she's called the Queen of the South. Our Savior calls her that, for Sheba lies south of Canaan. The common opinion is that was in Africa, and that the Christians in Ethiopia to this day are so confident they came to their country. But it's more probable that she came from the southern part of Arabia. So the Queen of Sheba, according to, this is the Matthew Henry's commentary, this is more likely to be from the Arab area, or North Africa. The Queen of Sheba has been identified as the rulers of the Sabians, which inhabited Arabia Felix. That's according to Wycliffe's Bible commentary. So we've got a couple of different places where people have said, commentaries said, look, now this is really, even the Queen of Sheba is probably not from Ethiopia. Now the NIV actually gets verse 43 translated correctly. It says, in one sense, it says, he will gain control of the treasures of gold and silver and all the riches of Egypt, and the Libyans and Nubians in submission. Now, while it's remotely possible that some Ethiopians are referred to here, the reality is the Nubians make more sense. Why? The Nubians are Muslims. They historically have lived amongst the Egyptians and some of the other Arabs. They've had so much contact with the Arabs that they say some of their people have been Arabized. And this is from the Nubian.net website. They're warning about this. Now, well, Nubians currently live in Egypt as well as in neighboring Sudan. The Sudanese, like the Libyans, are Cushites. They're dark people. They're mostly Muslim. Matter of fact, they had kind of a war fought there between the north, which is Muslim, and the small part of the south, which is predominantly Greco-Roman Protestant Catholic kind of religion. So most of the Sudanese, though, are Muslim. Now, I had read the passage about gold and silver being taken from Egypt in Daniel 11:43. Gold deposits have been found in Egypt, so we'll see how that may be fulfilled, because that will be something that the king of the north is going to go after. And again, in the passages that we saw in Ezekiel Chapter 30, verses 4 and 5, we saw that the king of Egypt's power, they're going to lose their wealth. And Egypt is going to have a lot of wealth. They have a lot of gold in Egypt right now. Now, the Bible talks about a coming Arab-Turkish confederation. If you take your Bible and go to Psalm 83, verses 4 through 8, I'd like to read that. Psalm 83, starting in verse 4. They have said, come and let us cut them off from being a nation, that the name of Israel may be remembered no more. Now this is talking about not only the little nation of Israel, but without going through all the prophecies now, in the book of Genesis 48, Israel put his hands on Ephraim and Manasseh and said, let my name be placed upon them. And so that would include the Anglo-descended peoples who descended from those people. Well, anyway, verse 5. For they have consulted together with one consent. They form a confederacy against you. The tents of Edom, that's the Turks, the Ishmaelites, like the Arabs, the Moab and Hagarites, Gebal, Ammon, Amalek, Philistine, the inhabitants of Tyre. So this is basically, these are Arabic and Turkish peoples primarily. Assyria has joined with them. They have helped the children of Lot. So apparently there is a deal here. Notice a deal is made involving these peoples and Assyria. Now, without going to that depth right now, Assyria is represented here as this will be the king of the north, will be primarily an Assyrian power. And that's important to know because, as I mentioned before, the king of the south is going to be betrayed by some of these people. Notice they will enter into confederacy with the Syrian king of the north power. Now, back in December 1979, talking about this, the old Plain Truth magazine, it says, King David of ancient Israel, in a prophetic Psalm 83, provides additional insight in the Middle East picture. Germany, Assyrian Bible prophecy, and perhaps the rest of Europe will be in league in the future with a union of Arab nations, a vast confederacy bound together in effort to crush out the name of Israel from the face of the earth. This Arab-Muslim confederacy may well be the previously mentioned king of the south, a sphere of power encompassing vast portions of the Islamic world. They have said, come, let's come up remembrance. Then he's going through the tabernacles of Edom, Esau, modern-day Turkey, a non-Arab but Islamic nation, Ishmaelites, Saudi Arabia, Moab, part of Jordan, the Hagarenes, anciently these people inhabited the area known as Syria today, Gebal, Lebanon, Ammon, modern Jordan, Amalek, part of the Turks, the Philistines, the modern Palestinians, inhabitants of Tyre, Lebanon, Asher, whose descendants, the Assyrians, migrated to Germany, also joined in them. But in the end, this European-Arab alliance will be short-lived, and the king of the north will come against him, the king of the south. The Arab-Muslim confederation will, of course, be thrown into chaotic disarray in the fact of invasion. And that's what the Bible teaches. And that's what I've been saying that the old Worldwide Church of God taught as well, even though some don't seem to understand that. Now, as I mentioned before, Daniel 11:27 says both these kings are going to get together and they're going to be bent on evil, to speak lies to one another. But again, we see that there will be a deal between the king of the north and the king of the south. And by the way, when the king of the north takes over the king of the south, he will have the whole old Holy Roman Empire. That Roman Empire basically encompassed the Mediterranean Sea. And that's what we're seeing starting to happen now. It's clear to me, and hopefully it's clear to you, that according to the Bible, there's going to be a future king of the south. He's supposed to rise up at the appointed time of the end. And because the nations involved are essentially Islamic, we should be looking for some type of group to start to put this type of thing together. That's what the old Radio Church of God taught. That's what the old Worldwide Church of God taught. Various Church of God leaders have taught this throughout history. And even the Catholic Saint Jerome felt that the European power, or the Antichrist power, was going to destroy the king of the south and go into Egypt. Since the end has not come yet, Jesus hasn't returned, obviously we're looking for the time of the king of the south to rise up. Groups like the Muslim Brotherhood are making progress. They don't always make straight progress. They're going to have ups and downs. Ultimately, though, they want to take over Syria. The United States has been funding an opposition group there who has got, their leaders at least, have ties to the Muslim Brotherhood. We're seeing the Muslim Brotherhood ebb and flow in places like Tunisia, Northern Africa. It's got some political clout in Jordan. It's trying to do things in the Middle East. And it is setting up this foundation. Sadly, for the Islamic peoples and those Islamic nations, they need to realize they shouldn't be supporting this type of power. The Bible is clear in Daniel 11:40-43, in Ezekiel 31-9, as well as some of the other passages as I alluded to, that this confederation will fail. They will not succeed. For a while, they'll be jubilant about it, but it will not succeed. Anyway, there will be a future king of the south. We're seeing events in the world news today showing that it rises up. Those who do not believe or understand that there will be a future king of the south will not understand what's going to happen. They will not understand end-time prophecy. But because the Bible teaches it, we need to believe it, because the understanding of the identity of the king of the south is one of the critical elements understanding end-time Bible prophecy and where we stand with it. This is Dr. Bob Thiel telling you, believe what your Bible says and not false prophets and those who do not understand what the Bible teaches you.